A lot of people don't realize the critical role that Chicago played, and really continues to play, in American agriculture. The Stockyards, the world's first meatpacking industry, the Chicago International Livestock Exposition, the development of the Angus breed. Broadcasting from the heart of rural America in beautiful St. Joseph, Missouri, this is Angus Talk. I'm your host, Doug Medlock, and we're bringing you the latest in-depth conversations about the cattle industry from the American Angus Association. Thanks for joining us. With us today is historian and author Richard Lindberg. Richard is specialized in Chicago history and probably knows as much about the history of the great city as anyone in the country. We're very fortunate to have you on the broadcast today, Richard. Hello.
It's nice to be here with you.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a Chicago author. I've written 16 books about the Windy City and its history, its development as a city, crime, politics, sports, ethnic settlement. I've been writing professionally about the city of Chicago since the mid-1970s.
Well, you grew up there, right, in the Windy City?
Yes, I did. And I grew up at a time when the Stockyards were still flourishing on the south side. They were in their waning days, as I recall. But it really was a great epic of Chicago, that 106-year period when the city was the hog butcher to the world, if you will.
And a lot of early industrialists who played important parts in the Stockyards?
Absolutely. Consortium was a big four: Philip Danforth Armour, Gustavus Franklin Swift, Nelson Morris, and Patrick Cudahy, who was actually from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. These men really were the great innovators of their day, and they recognized the potential of Chicago, particularly from the standpoint of transportation. I mean, you have to realize that Chicago was a frontier village surrounding Fort Dearborn, inhabited by English-speaking settlers and surrounded by the native people across a broad expanse of prairie. And actually, the city's original nickname, the city of the Wild Onion, was from the stench of the onions that grew along the shore of Lake Michigan.
Wow.
But really, from a few dozen pioneer families in 1814, the city grew remarkably to 500,000 people by 1880 and surpassed the million mark in 1890, primarily due to, as they say, transportation is everything, and the proximity of the railroads and the Great Lakes really fueled the magnificent growth of Chicago.
So you had everything you needed right there in the center of the country. What draws everybody to the same place.
Yeah, it's not quite in the center of the country, but almost. And every railroad converging upon the city had to stop in Chicago. If they were going from east to west, people had to change their train and continue on west. Same way from south to north.
And what would be going on a typical day in the Stockyards? What were some of the stuff they did there?
Well, really, the Stockyards was two different components. It was packing town, which was directly to the west of the Stockyards, which were then headquartered at Halsted and Exchange Avenue. But the interesting thing, just to go a little bit further back, was that as early as the 1850s, Chicago had a stockyard presence. At that time, there were 5 railroads, but they were scattered all around the city. And so very often, the animals that were coming to Chicago for slaughter were dropped off at different points in the city, and they had to be driven through the streets, particularly down Archer Avenue, which is a diagonal street that runs southwest from the city. So you had all these animals, all the cattle and the pigs, and they're running willy-nilly down the streets. Often they would escape into the backyards of people's homes, and
Wow.
They would cause massive congestion in downtown Chicago. So that really contributed to the decision really to build a consortium of 9 railroad lines, and they acquired 320 acres of swampland for the sum of $100,000 in 1864 in a neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, which has come to be known as New City. And they were called the Sherman Stockyards.
$100,000. How much is that today, I wonder?
Oh, I don't think you can imagine it. Packing town spanned 14 acres and included beef and pork houses, smoke houses, warehouses, cold storage facilities, lard refineries, fertilizer and glue factories.
Man.
Really, it was
its own city within a city there.
Pardon me?
It's its own city within a city.
It was a city within a city, absolutely. And by the late 1880s, it employed over 20,000 people. And Chicago became the nation's meatpacking capital, and coinciding with its emergence as the railroad capital.
And this had a huge effect on life in America because now people didn't necessarily have to live on the farm to get fresh farm foods.
Right. It really was the beginning, in its early years, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America. It was luring people from the hinterland into the great city. It would really mark the beginning of a profound shift in American life. And they came to the city anticipating great opportunity and a chance to make money and better themselves. But so often they were caught up in the industrial grind of the city. Packingtown was a city unto itself. And in the 1880s and the 1890s, as immigrants arrived from Europe, particularly from Eastern Europe and Italy and so forth, they settled here and they were able to buy homes on the installment plan. It really marked the fledgling time when when private ownership of homes for the common man, for the working man, came into vogue. Of course, a lot of people were able to hold on to those houses only a short time due to illness, sickness, or just the inability to meet mortgages. Many people were foreclosed upon. And that really was underscored in Upton Sinclair's great novel of 1906 called The Jungle.
When people had homes but couldn't keep the payments up.
Well, that was true. And all those little cottages on the southwest side often changed hands, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year. But really the economy, livelihoods were closely intertwined with the stockyards and their remarkable growth in the second half of the
before the stockyards and the ability to bring all this produce and product to people, what did people eat in the city? What was there to eat?
Well, there were truck farms surrounding the city. Chicago has a street system today. It has a number of old Indian trails that ran out on diagonals, Claiborne Avenue, Elston Avenue. These were original roadways that were created by the native people, and they became streets. And these streets extended far out into the rural counties of Illinois. And often, what would happen is that the farmers would take their produce to market in dog carts and in wagons, and they would come down Elston, Claiborne, and all the other streets of that along that line. They'd have to often pay tolls to get into the city. It was a lot of unscrupulous people that would force them to pay tolls. They would come into downtown Chicago, and there was an open-air produce market called the South Water Street Market, which is today Wacker Drive, fronting the Chicago River.
Oh, yeah.
And here, produce was sold in exchange. This is how people ate. Meat was available. I mean, as I mentioned, there were stockyards in the 1850s, but not to the massive level of slaughter and distribution that would occur after the opening of the Sherman Stockyards on Christmas Day of 1865.
And you were talking about the town, the city within a city. Even the Aberdeen Angus office was right there on the grounds.
Yes, all of the drovers and the packing companies built their offices in very close proximity to the stockyards, right just west of Halsted Street, which was the main thoroughfare, which extends from north to south and just skirts along the western edge of town. And the actual the 2,000 stalls where the pigs and the hogs were sheltered were really 2 separate entities there.
We're talking about the Chicago Stockyards and the great history of Chicago with historian Richard Lindberg. And when we come back, we want to dive more into the history of the stockyards and talk about the Chicago International Livestock Exposition, which at the time was the world's largest and most important livestock show. We'll be right back.
Looking for a way to buy or sell Angus cattle and genetics online? Then visit AngusTradingPost.com. Owned and operated by Angus Productions Incorporated, the trusted publisher of the Angus Journal and Angus Beef Bulletin. AngusTradingPost.com is the industry's new and reliable online Angus marketplace. Sign up today at AngusTradingPost.com.
And we're back with Richard Lindberg, historian and author. We should mention on his website, you can learn more about his books by visiting richardlindberg.net. That's Richard, Lindberg.net. We hope you take some time to go there and look around at the great body of work Richard's done. And we appreciate you joining us here on Angus Talk. We were talking about the history of the Chicago Stockyards, how it came to be close to the center of America with transportation from the rail yards and all the produce and commerce available in there in one spot. And right about the same time the Stockyards started is when the Chicago International Livestock Exposition started.
Well, the Livestock Exposition, as it was commonly known and its great popularity in the 20th century, really got its start during the time of the Chicago World's Fair of 1892. There was a livestock exposition on the grounds of the World's Fair in Jackson Park, and the American Livestock Association, which was organized that same year in 1892 to exhibit at the fair, went out of business shortly after the fair had ended, merging into a larger, though newer organization called the National Livestock Association. There were, at the time, 70 minor associations in the national, and it was all of them were encouraged and really wanted to take part in a grander, larger scale exposition that would kind of expand upon the original show in 1892. So in November of 1899, the first steps to organize for the proposed International Livestock Show were held at a meeting at the Exchange Hotel, which was right in the heart of the Stockyards district, and the Exchange Hotel is where many of the cattlemen, the drovers, and the packers would often stay when they came to town. And all the representatives from all the breeding associations, which were in session there that week, and representatives of livestock interests in Chicago, converged, and they decided to launch this great exposition. And the first one took place in 1900 in what was then called Dexter Pavilion, which was an exhibition in a racing oval. In an exhibition kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a stadium, but nevertheless, it was the exhibition grounds, and it was named after the great trotting horse Dexter, who had won many trotting races in the 1860s and was just as well known in his day as Man of War and Secretariat.
Wow.
But the stock show was an immediate hit, and by 1910, the Union Stockyards, more than 7,000 animals were shipped by the carload to be displayed, and then competitions were held, and prizes were awarded. There were scholarships that were given out by J. Ogden Armour, the son of the patriarch Armour. There were different lines of competition. 4-H clubs were slowly born as a result of it. And it was really, the real key thing was the education of the city folk and the bringing together of people from the growing regions into the urban area. And it was a chance really just to elevate, probably, in some sense, elevate the quality of the food that the people in the city would eat. Farmers and livestock men were encouraged to grow better cattle, and these were some of the reciprocal benefits of this show. And it became an enormous event every year up until 1976, when the last one was held.
And what happened?
Enormously anticipated then.
What happened? Why the demise?
Well, economic factors. The thrust of technology certainly came into play. It was no longer really necessary to actually transport the animals to the city. That it could be done on site in different locations in the West and the Southwest. It was discontinued initially in 1976 for lack of funds. Diminishing attendance were given as reasons for the demise. There were committees that were formed. They tried to consider ways and means of obtaining additional private capital to revive the show in 1977. And the late Mayor Richard J. Daley, who was mayor of Chicago for 21 years, this happened at the end of his long and lengthy term of office, and he had fought hard to avoid the discontinuation of the show. He said it was always a great show and one of the greatest in the country. It's really regrettable to see it leave, especially for the farmers of Illinois and for the rest of the Midwest. In fact, the Stockyards Show was the oldest annual convention in the city at the time, and millions of people had visited from out of town, and millions of dollars worth of prize cattle, sheep, hogs, and horses from throughout the U.S. and Canada were bartered on and sold, and it was just really arguably Chicago's first great trade show, and we are known as a convention city and have been really as a result of the Stockyards Show.
And what happens there now? What became of the Stockyards?
Well, the Stockyards really exist only in memory. The stone gate, the stone arch, which so many animals and people had crossed under at Exchange Avenue and 42nd or 43rd Street, is just standing there rather forlornly. In bas-relief is a head of a cattle. The animal is named after Sherman, after the founder, John Sherman, who, ironically enough, as he built the yards in 1865, he built it with the belief that the city of Chicago would never grow so fast and so far as to incur upon the region of the Stockyards. He had no idea and could not anticipate that out on that farmland, about 4 miles south of Chicago, that the city itself would grow at such amazing speed and would completely surround the Stockyards.
You can't stop progress.
Right, you can't stop progress. He thought that he was so far away from the central city that surely no one would be coming out that way, and that he can continually expand his yards. But within a couple of decades, that neighborhood of New City and the back of the yards neighborhood really filled in.
Now, the building, the amphitheater, where they had the exposition, I know they had some big convention there, political convention.
Well, 3 national nominating conventions were held there. It was an important amphitheater and public arena for decades. It opened in 1934 following the Great Stockyards Fire earlier that year, which destroyed about 90% of the buildings and the pens. And it opened up bigger and better, and over the years it held all kinds of events, including the Hay and Grain Show. That was one of the very first events. 5,000 samples of hay and grain from Canada and the U.S.
Wow.
In the first year, they had a birthday party for President Franklin Roosevelt, which brought in 20,000 people. In later years, of course, the Beatles played there. It was a host. It was a host building for several sports teams. There was a hockey team in the old World Hockey Association that played there. The Chicago Bulls played there. It was an old and venerable stadium, and although it was significantly known really as a temple for agriculture because it was so intertwined with the stock shows and with the Union Stockyards.
Wow, and the building is still there? In
1999, it closed its doors. It was sold. It went through several different ownerships. It was sold in 1983 for $250,000. The city acquired it. And then actual demolition of the property began in 1999. It's an empty lot right now, and directly across the street is the Aramark uniform plant. So the whole area has kind of gone through a period of
has
decline.
A different look today.
Well, it's a very different look. You have the Stockyards Industrial Park.
Yeah.
A lot of mixed-use office buildings and warehousing for all kinds of industries. And really the only visible reminder of the great heyday of the Stockyards is Sherman the Bull, which stands atop
Oh, cool.
The arch that enters into the park.
And you mentioned that the amphitheater was built in 34 after the big fire. Now, was that the big O'Leary's cow in the barn fire?
No. That was in 1871. That was a Great Fire of Chicago. The fire of May 19th, 1934, 90% of the district was burned down, including the Exchange Building, the famous Stockyard Inn restaurant, and the fire was of such enormity that it could be seen as far away as Indiana.
Wow.
And but believe it or not, really with the resilience and the I will spirit of Chicago, the Stockyards was actually reopened within a couple of days after the fire. The real heyday of the Stockyards really was, I believe, from the mid-1920s up to the 1950s. Some of the big meat packers began moving their offices out of Chicago in the mid-1950s. It was the thrust of technology that was really doing it in. So the shows beginning in the 1960s just were not nearly well as attended. And of course it also speaks to changing culture, changing popular culture in Chicago, and the lack of interest of kids who were coming of age during that era, and 4-H clubs began to diminish. So in that, coupled with the economics of it, the distance of Chicago from the grazing areas, I mean, it really kind of spelled the death knell of the industry there.
Is there a lesson to be learned for the city of Chicago in the history of the Stockyards? Looking back, is there something to take from that?
Well, I think that the lesson we learned is that the spirit of entrepreneurship has always been alive in the city. Chicago is a city. It's not an age. It's not New York. It's not Philadelphia. It's a rather new city in the history of the country. It was a city that encouraged and brought entrepreneurs to Chicago. In fact, Henry Ford got the idea for the assembly line by coming to Chicago and observing packing town. The disassembly of the animals, the waste and byproduct of animals, which were turned into hairbrushes and into ointment and into every other imaginable kind of tool, was carefully studied by Henry Ford. And he went back to Detroit and he started his own assembly line for the production of the automobile from the lessons learned in Chicago. Chicago is part and parcel of the history of innovation, of industrialization, and the Stockyards were a metaphor of important historic times. But I think the secondary lessons to learn from this is that we cannot take anything for granted. Industry exists for a period of time, and then new industry comes in. Technology comes in. We've lost our steel yards. We've lost packing town. We're not a factory town anymore, per se. Much like Pittsburgh lost its steel business, Chicago has had to reinvent itself, as it did in the 1880s and 1890s. It went from a pastoral, agrarian city to a city of great industry, and now at this point in our history, we're evolving into a service economy and a high-tech corridor.
So the only constant is change. Be ready for it.
The only constant is change, and I think that's the one takeaway from it. And you get a real sense of that when you drive down Halsted Street and you look at the weed lots that stand across from where the cattle pens used to be. You drive in, go down South Exchange Avenue for about a block, and there you see Sherman the Bull in the Great Arch, and then you look around and you are struck by the silence of the place. In the old days, it was the sound, it was the smell. The smell of the rendering plants would often waft across the Great South Side. And when the White Sox were playing in nearby Comiskey Park at night, you could smell the cattle, you could smell the manure while you're sitting there watching the game. It was a vanished era, but it was a spectacular era in so many ways.
Wow. Thank you, Richard. We've been joined today by historian and author Richard Lindberg, talking about the Chicago Stockyards. You can learn more about Richard and his books by visiting www.richardlindberg.net. That's Richard, Lindberg.net. Thanks for joining us, Richard. We really appreciate
It's
it.
been my great pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Angus Talk, brought to you by the American Angus Association. I'm Doug Medlock. Thanks for listening.